Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Tim Dillon did an interview with Max Blumenthal, who is the founder of the Gray Zone, which is a news outlet, an independent media outlet of somewhat dubious credibility, but we'll get to that in a second. And they talked about this reporting that Blumenthal did about Charlie Kirk. Apparently, in the sort of lead up to his death, he had become more critical of Israel, started to change his tune on certain pro-Israel narratives, and this was after a long time of essentially being backed by Israel with his organization Turning Point USA. So I do want to say that Gray Zone has always sketched me out a little bit as an organization. I remember going back to the days of like the Russiagate stuff and many things that have happened in between. There's always an angle that Gray Zone takes that is sort of anti-American establishment for the sake of it. And there's definitely accusations that they have taken money from Iran and Russia. And there were even some payments that were revealed to the editor of the Gray Zone from Iran. Max Blumenthal, the person who appears in this clip, has been to Russia. He's appeared on Russia Today. So there's connections there, and don't have any confusion about that. And it seems like any type of actual journalism, independent journalism, corporate journalism, whatever it may be, it has to have this type of backing, because journalism is something that requires a lot of resources to do properly. So I don't think that that completely ruins their credibility journalistically, because I think journalism is one of those things where if you do it properly, the truth of it will outlive whatever the circumstances of whoever funded it or whatever. But at the same time, it does affect the angle. And Gray Zone, Glenn Greenwald, you know, these are examples of outlets that have always had that vibe to me of, you know, wanting to turn America's internal issues or issues that are important to America into some kind of international framework that seems to have a little bit of a slant to it. So I can flesh that out a little bit more later, but let me get to this clip here. I just wanted to say that I'm not going to be fully uncritical of this. I am critical of the Gray Zone as an outlet. I'm certainly critical of Tim Dillon, and he's the type of dupe that will uncritically platform somebody who has like a huge machine of an agenda behind them without realizing it. So that's an important dynamic to keep in mind here. But at the same time, there seems to be more to this angle than I thought there was. So we'll get into that. And then I'll also get into this stuff about this supposed trans roommate that the shooter had, and the information that we know about that so far. Although I suspect by the time people hear this, we'll have learned more about that. So I'm not going to get into that as much in this episode. But here's Tim Dillon with Max Blumenthal.
Okay. So this is one of the most fascinating stories I've witnessed in American politics. It could be the theme of a film or a documentary or a book. Charlie Kirk began coming under pressure from his own base. I would say, I actually forgot which year it was, but it was like 3 or 4 years ago. And it was called the Groyper Wars. And Charlie Kirk would do these TPUSA tours around the country, and young men would file in, and they would, you get to question Charlie Kirk and debate him. And they hit him from an angle he never expected. They were from this organization called the Groypers, which sort of follows Nick Fuentes. They're anti-Israel. They're kind of anti-Jewish. Some people call them white nationalists, whatever you want to call them. They're very anti-Israel, and they believe they're the true voice of America first, because the US government has fallen under the control of this malign foreign power in Israel. And so they would confront Charlie Kirk with the history of, for example, the USS Liberty, the US naval ship that was deliberately struck by the Israeli military in the 1967 war in order to cripple that boat, because it was a surveillance boat. It was listening to Israeli communications. And they killed scores of sailors. And they would confront Charlie Kirk with the difference between Israeli interests and American interests while holding up a cross. And Charlie Kirk would just shut down the conversation because he knew that if he would give an inch to them, it would threaten the relationship with his donors and TPUSA would collapse. Now, after October 7th, the pressure was just too extreme. The whole grassroots of the conservative movement, everyone under 35, started to question the US-Israel relationship because they wanted to be America first. And they saw Netanyahu just leading Trump around by the balls. They saw Miriam Adelson, this Israeli intelligence asset billionaire, just calling shots inside the White House. And a lot of them are pro-life and were horrified by the slaughter of babies that they saw in Gaza. So the bottom dropped out of right-wing youth support for Israel to the point where now only about 25% of Republicans under 35 support Israel over Palestine. So Charlie Kirk has to answer to his own grassroots base, and you can hear he's starting to make some noises. He's talking about October 7th possibly being an inside job. Israel let it happen in order to carry out long-term political goals. He starts to question whether Jeffrey Epstein was an Israeli Mossad agent at a time when the Epstein files were becoming an uncomfortable issue for Trump. And it all blew out into the open at TPUSA's July Youth Summit in, I believe it was Tampa, Florida.
Yeah.
Might have been Tallahassee.
Yeah, Tucker gave the speech.
Right. So Tucker gave a speech. I mean, that was the seminal moment, but it wasn't just Tucker. Megyn Kelly had started questioning Israel, and she's on stage calling Jeffrey Epstein a Mossad agent with Charlie. Comic Dave Smith, who, like myself, is a Jewish anti-Zionist, but he more comes from kind of the libertarian world. So he was welcomed on stage to debate a Zionist propagandist who works for Newsweek, Joshua Hammer. No, that's not something you want, especially at this point, if you are like a pro-Israel enforcer. And after that, he started getting publicly attacked. Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin, the two biggest Zionist enforcers in the media, who are very close to Netanyahu, biggest forces lobbying Trump to wage war on Iran, went off on TPUSA, said we can't be having a Big Ten if it includes kooks. Laura Loomer, we all know who she is. She publicly attacked Charlie Kirk and said he basically had to step down. He was getting attacked in pro-Israel media. What we didn't know, which I learned, is in private, the pressure was even more intense. He was being bombarded with text messages. And at some point, Netanyahu personally called him and offered to basically fund his organization to new levels that he never even imagined, which meant, Zionist Israeli takeover, complete recapture of TPUSA, an organization they basically helped create. And Charlie Kirk turned him down. Now, after Charlie Kirk was killed, we know that Netanyahu wouldn't stop posting about him. Like minutes after he was killed, when his body was still warm, Netanyahu was posting about him, interrupting his seven-front war in the Middle East and his global assassination spree, where he's trying to kill people even inside a U.S. ally in Qatar. I mean, I've been told, yes, that Israel is a major source of concern for Trump. I mean, think about it. What would happen
this is
if the
our
president
ally.
if he suspended
That's why I'm confused.
if he suspended arms to a country that carries out assassinations all across the globe, that specializes in assassinations, that has an entire wing of its intelligence services that conducts assassinations, including with household goods like pagers, would you not be scared? So yes, Trump is scared. And what I learned from this source, who is a Trump insider, someone who talks to who talks to people in the Oval Office, people close to Trump, is that during one of Netanyahu's many visits to the US this year, some figures in his retinue, Israeli agents, placed electronic devices on emergency response Secret Service vehicles. The Secret Service found them and they reported this to the White House. These would be emergency response vehicles that would respond to an incident potentially involving the president. All right, some people watching this might be dismissing me as crazy right now, and I wasn't able to confirm this. I can't just call up the Secret Service and have them tell me that. But in 2019, 3 former high-ranking U.S. officials from the Trump administration told Politico that listening devices were found around the White House and at sensitive locations across Washington targeting President Trump. They wanted to listen to his calls and communications, and they were planted by Israel.
All right, so some interesting stuff there, as well as some red flags. First of all, when he mentions the Groypers, and he actually gives an interesting recounting of what the so-called Groyper Wars were and how that was related to Charlie Kirk and what the split was between the followers of Nick Fuentes and the followers of Charlie Kirk. But to reference the Groypers and then just say like, well, some people call them white nationalists, they're kind of anti-Jewish. To mention the Groypers and not make it very clear that these people are essentially neo-Nazis is extremely suspect and very irresponsible. And the other thing he says about Dave Smith debating what he calls the biggest Zionist propagandist in America at Newsweek or whatever he said. But then he says, oh, but Zionist enforcers in the media, you wouldn't want debate. You look at debate and you said, no, we can't have that. But if the guy you're talking about is a Zionist propagandist, why would he be doing a debate? So my issue is not that it's not accurate to say that guy's a Zionist propagandist. It's not accurate to say that there are so-called Zionist enforcers in the media. It's just very politicized language. And that type of language is exactly what has always sort of raised my hackles about people like the Gray Zone, Blumenthal, Greenwald, even Jimmy Dore gave me that sense when I used to listen to him talking about the media and like during Russiagate and stuff when he was railing against the media for Russiagate. And then later he was doing it on COVID. And a lot of these outlets like the Gray Zone were taking the same tone on that, where they're just critiquing the establishment narrative for the sake of it. And it's usually when you're using language like that, like Zionist enforcer and things like that, it creates, when you give it a title, it creates a different image in your mind than just saying that somebody even like is a tool of Israel or is pro-Zionist. A pro-Zionist propagandist is a lot different than saying a Zionist enforcer. So I just wonder what the difference is between those two things and why he didn't clarify that. And that highly politicized language makes me skeptical, even though I'm inclined to agree with the sort of what he's proposing there. But that's the kind of thing that makes me a little sus about this guy. And it makes what he's saying sound a little bit more like some kind of international agenda than like just honest, somebody just calling it how they see it. I don't get that vibe from Blumenthal. It seems like he, just as much as anybody else, kind of has an angle that he knows he has to push. And it seems like even the quality reporting that is done at the Gray Zone or whatever, it usually has that type of angle. And that being said, I think what he's talking about with Kirk is interesting here, as well as, it's objectively weird that after Kirk was killed, Netanyahu immediately came out and said, we did not do this. As far as I know, he wasn't really being accused of doing it. I'm sure in some circles he was. Obviously, in some places on the internet, people were saying that. But it was weird that he came out and preempted that. And then there's also a very interesting dynamic between Kirk and Ben Shapiro, because he's correct that Kirk started to criticize Israel in some ways, even saying things like, Israel might have had some awareness about October 7th and allowed it to happen in order to accomplish long-term political goals. I think that's pretty much the understanding that I have at this point. And Ben Shapiro came out and was definitely criticizing him over that. And the fact that Ben Shapiro is now the one that wants to take up the mantle after Kirk has died, that's telling, right? Ben Shapiro wasted no time coming out and saying, we're going to pick up where he left off. At first, people were saying Ben Shapiro is going to take over for Turning Point USA. That's not true. Looks like Charlie Kirk's wife is going to be running Turning Point USA. So, before I move on from this, the last things I'll say is that he mentions these sources that he has, people that were close friends of Charlie Kirk, and then also in reference to talking about, conversations and fears that Trump had and like intimate knowledge of what's going on inside the White House about how he has sources there. So I think who he's talking about here is probably J.D. Vance or Tulsi Gabbard or both. J.D. Vance is likely to have been a longtime friend of Charlie Kirk, or at least to know him. And Tulsi Gabbard, when it comes to intelligence stuff, is probably the one who would be willing to talk to a guy like Blumenthal and to have a pre-existing relationship with him. So I think it's likely that those are the sources that he's talking about. And it's possible that whatever friend of Charlie he's talking about is not somebody in the White House, but it seemed like he was saying that there's a commonality there. And some of the conversations in the article that are recounted between Charlie Kirk and Donald Trump, these are happening at high levels. It seems like probably the only person that would be in the room for that would be somebody like J.D. Vance. So that's probably his source here. Obviously somebody who has an agenda of their own, but potentially somebody who's seeing these connections and these pressures that are being put on people by Israel and wants to put it out there in some way, as well as feeling like maybe leaking to the gray zone is a better way to stay under the president's radar. Whereas if you say certain things to certain outlets that Trump's going to see, then he'll probably know who it was or figure it out. So that's who I think is behind this story here. And the thing that's interesting about this, if let's say it's true that there's some kind of Israeli intelligence angle to Charlie Kirk's death, that contradicts the Groyper narrative, which right now it seems pretty clear that this kid was some kind of Groyper or in online channels like that. He's not cooperating with law enforcement right now, is what they're saying, and apparently the people around him are, including this person who is supposedly a roommate. So again, we'll get back to that. But the whole angle of him being a Groyper is that he's a follower of Nick Fuentes who hated Charlie Kirk for that reason. So if that's true, then that means that the reason that person killed Charlie Kirk is because Charlie Kirk was too pro-Israel. So if Charlie Kirk was making a turn on that, that would mean that he's making a turn in the direction that the so-called Groypers would have wanted him to be turning. And that is what would have pissed off Israel to make them kill him. So I don't think that's true because even as noted in the article, there's no substantive proof or anything that would indicate that Israel had to do with the murder. But the idea that there's something going on behind the scenes in terms of pressure campaigns that may have led up to what we saw in some way does seem like there's some substance there. But again, it could just be that Max Blumenthal is using this moment in history to sort of shoehorn that narrative in there because there's an opportunity to do so. And he, for some reason, has some obligation or incentive to do it. So that leads me back to what is going on with the current shooter that we know. So he's not cooperating. This story about the trans roommate. So as far as I can tell, there's one Fox News employee who originally tweeted out that it is confirmed that he had a trans lover or roommate of some kind. That story then got posted in the New York Post, and then after that got posted in Fox News. So it's interesting that Fox News didn't report on it first, given that their employee was the one who originally said it. That employee said this information was based on quote-unquote sources. New York Post said the same thing. They said sources. When it got published in Fox News, what Fox News said was high-level FBI sources. And after that story got published to Fox News, none other than Kash Patel reposted it. So it seems like Kash Patel was probably the source or was aware of that. Fox News is one of the outlets that there's going to be open communication between the administration, and they're going to use an outlet like Fox News to purposely put something out. So I think what happened here, without knowing what's going on with this roommate or who that is, I'm very skeptical of that narrative, very skeptical that they're trans or that they're actually lovers. But I think we'll probably find out about that later today. I think that probably because it was the weekend, there wasn't any official updates or announcement. The Utah governor has been the only one out saying anything about this, and I think that's on purpose. I think he recognizes that there's an abdication of responsibility happening here. Like I said, he was the one who told us that there are bots from like foreign entities that are trying to stoke disunion in America, where it seemed like that would something that the FBI director should say. So what I think is that over the weekend, they, have not issued any official reports, and they probably will at some point on Monday. They're going to give us something, I would assume. But I think they purposely left the weekend open. They left a vacuum of information that now has been filled by, reporters trying to spread this trans story. So that has caught on with the right wing. They are running with it all the way to the hills. And they're saying anything from, okay, the shooter is confirmed trans, the shooter is confirmed Antifa, he had a trans lover. None of that is confirmed yet. We have one story in Fox News that other reporters are now basing their own stories off of. I haven't seen any confirmation, and from what I can tell, the only thing publicly that we can see that indicates that this person who was supposedly a roommate of the shooter was trans is some picture of him with a filter on that, there's no other indication that this was a person who was transitioning, and they have profiles that are publicly available, as well as the Utah governor. When saying that this person was trans, he originally referenced the pronoun they. He said referred to them as they, and then he corrected to he, even though this was supposedly a male to female trans person. And so maybe he was just being transphobic on purpose, but it seems to me, even though I think he's a Republican, it seems to me that he has an interest in being accurate in this case. It seems like that's what he's trying to do, is be accurate and call balls and strikes. So I don't know why he would land on the pronoun he if that wasn't accurate. So it seems like there's something fishy going on with that roommate, and they're trying to use that in the absence of being able to tell us what's actually going on with this person in order to paint a narrative. And that could also mean that the information they do currently have about the shooter does not align, that's not the information they want to put out there. And so instead, they're giving us this stuff about the roommate, which the right wing has run with. Maybe they don't have any more information about the shooter because they're currently looking through his stuff, but he's not cooperating, so there's nothing for them to give us. But to me, it seems more likely that what they're learning is not aligned with this, trans Antifa narrative, and so they have to give us something that seems more aligned with that in the meantime. I'll have more updates for you guys soon. The last thing I'll say, while I don't know if I believe this Israel narrative, there seems to be something to it, more so than I thought, in terms of Charlie Kirk, going against Israel. Netanyahu offered him money and he turned it down, and then this happened shortly after that. That's kind of crazy, as well as what Blumenthal says about Trump, fearing that the Israelis are spying on him. There's some substance to that as well. That's not outlandish, what he's talking about. So, the only thing I can think of here is that I would much rather people on the right be focused on this narrative that this was Israel that did this than trans people and Antifa. Obviously I don't want Jewish people to be targeted by the right. I don't want Jewish people to be targeted by anybody, and that is a risk. But I do feel like with the way Trump immediately diverted attention to the left, it does seem like he's trying to divert attention away from somewhere else that it could go. And if this, Israel angle to Charlie Kirk's death picks up steam, it could diffuse some of this bloodthirsty rage that the right is now experiencing towards the left. And if we can get more of them talking about the Israel thing, because there is some substance to it, that could hopefully throw some water on this narrative of going after the left and going after trans people in any aspect that they can. I would hope. It seems like things are going to go in that direction anyway, but the more people on the right that are interested in investigating Israel's connection to, Trump and Charlie Kirk, the less of them that are going to be interested in trying to figure out how to kill a trans person.